I didn't tell my parents it was my wedding because they always prioritized my brother. They ignored my invites, and when my wedding went ahead without them, the family backlash hit hard. Now they're facing consequences, and I'm finally ready to cut ties for good. I, 27F, have a younger brother, Mike, 21M, who is the definition of a man-child and a mama's boy. He constantly complains and expects everyone to cater to him. He's just an overall jerk. Ever since he was born, my parents doted on him for everything. He's not special needs or had any traumatic birth experience, he was just born. And my parents completely ignored me, especially my mom, 50F. She went from being a loving mother to one of those boy moms that people make fun of online. My dad, 50M, still showed me love and support, but he's always been too much of a pushover to stand up to my mom and let me have a win. The only one who truly stood by me was my grandpa, 76M, who always called my parents out on their nonsense and never liked Mike. I remind him of my late grandma, and we share a special bond, but he lives on the other side of the country, so I didn't get to see him much. Mike knows our mom favors him and loves to rub it in my face. Because of this and his awful behavior, we've always had a strained relationship. He's spoiled, bratty, and a terrible person. I've lost count of how many times I got in trouble for things I did better than him or for things he falsely accused me of. His only talent is football. He got a scholarship to a good college out of state. Meanwhile, my parents didn't spend a dime on my education because they claimed my fund was used to cover expenses after a fire, only for me to later find out that money was given to Mike to buy a car and a house. It was at a public university where I met Lucas. He was the first person I truly connected with there. Of course, I met new people who are now my closest friends, and with their help and Lucas, who was my best friend before we got together, I was able to move out of my parents' house. Now both Lucas and I are well known in our fields and have very good salaries. Now, to the main issue. Lucas proposed to me a year ago. We're very private people, so we didn't post it on social media or anything, and when I told my parents they dismissed it with a, "That's nice," I'm starting to think they downright didn't listen to me at all. We decided that we wanted a nice but simple ceremony and reception with our friends and relatives. Lucas encouraged me to invite my parents and brother, but they never responded to the invitation. Whenever I visited and started talking about my wedding, without mentioning it was a wedding, my mom would always interrupt and talk about my brother's accomplishments and wild stories. Eventually, I got fed up and interrupted her to say there was an event I was planning that couldn't be changed. She responded that they couldn't attend because my brother had his last game of the season on that same day and wanted them there. This favoritism didn't surprise me at all. They'd missed my ballets, performances, and both my high school and college graduations for things related to him. At this point, I decided to be petty. I told my parents it wasn't an issue if they missed the event, purposely leaving out that it was my wedding and not pressing the matter further. A few weeks later, I got married. It was perfect. Lucas' family, my friends, and my family were all there, and we had a fantastic time. My grandpa was happy to give me away, and everything went smoothly. My relatives asked multiple times why my parents weren't there, and I simply told them they were attending my brother's game. They gave me some looks, and my grandpa was visibly upset for a while, but nothing else seemed off. After the reception, Lucas and I went on our honeymoon and were completely phone-free for the trip. When we returned, we were hit with a storm of notifications. Most of them were from my mom and brother. Mike called me all sorts of horrible names and insulted me because, apparently, one of my aunts had posted wedding photos on Facebook with a caption that was a clear jab at my parents, especially my mom, for not attending the wedding. The post apparently went viral in my parents' community, and they've been publicly shamed for their mistreatment of me. It also turns out that my grandpa personally visited my parents to go on a tirade to shame my father, his son, to the point of tears. And this seemed to be my father's breaking point, because he was so distraught for missing his only daughter's wedding and for his father's disapproval, that he finally rebelled against my mom and is threatening divorce unless she makes it up to me. I think that's the reason why my mom has been spamming my phone with messages, at first insulting and threatening and then downright pitiful, full of begging and pity parties. Now, I'm back home with my husband, figuring out how to handle the situation. Most of my relatives, even those I didn't invite to the wedding, have reached out to apologize for what happened and said they had no idea this was going on at home. I can't blame them since they all live far away with my grandpa or in another state. However, my mom's sisters and friends are criticizing me for not telling my mom about the wedding, claiming she's devastated about missing it. Personally, I think she's just saying that to save face, but I'm not sure. The most recent messages from my mom and dad sound deeply upset about missing the wedding. Now my family is split into 3 groups: the majority who is supporting me, my maternal aunts who are shaming me for hurting my mom's feelings, and my maternal grandparents who are insisting I forgive my mom because of her atonement. My best friends are advising me not to listen to any of them. For those who just want the gist, my parents have always preferred my younger brother over me and prioritized his events over mine. I got engaged and told everyone, but was brushed off. I sent wedding invitations to my parents and double-checked with them, but they never responded. When I told them the date, they said my brother had a game they had to attend. I didn't clarify that it was my wedding and told them it wasn't a big deal if they missed it. I went ahead with my wedding, and now my parents are facing backlash from my relatives and community after my aunt posted a pointed remark at my mom. Thank you so much for all the feedback and love, it's been overwhelming. I'll address some of the most common questions here. I did inform my parents about my wedding. I sent traditional paper invitations to all my guests and received confirmation that all invitations were delivered. I didn't get any response from my parents, Mike, a few distant relatives, or some people on Lucas' side. I reached out to everyone who hadn't replied to double-check, and those who didn't respond said they couldn't make it. I texted my parents and brother, but they never replied. I was left on read. Given everything I had to plan, I didn't push the issue. I didn't bring up the wedding date again because I had already been told about my brother's game. Plus, whenever I tried to focus attention on my own celebrations, I was dismissed and told it wasn't a big deal and that I shouldn't be upset or a bother. It was clear that some things were just more important than me, so at this point, I don't see the point in pushing it any further. It's not worth the effort. I didn't keep my wedding a secret. I purposely didn't tell my parents that it was my wedding to see if they would show any interest, but of course, they didn't. That said, I did talk openly about it with my aunts and uncles. My mom was in the room a few times when I discussed wedding venues or dress shops with my aunt, the one who posted on Facebook, but she was either on the phone or talking to others. She never paid attention. When I mentioned it during family gatherings, my mom just smiled and said, "That's great, dear," before changing the subject. My dad and Mike were silent. I kept in contact with them because, whenever I tried to go no contact in the past, I was harassed. I tried after high school, college, and my master's graduations, none of them bothered to show up, all because of my brother. Each time, I was shamed for wanting to distance myself from the family by my parents, my brother, and my maternal relatives. I think the difference now is that Lucas is by my side. We started dating shortly after my last attempt to go no contact, and, with his support, I feel more confident in standing my ground. Before that, though, I wasn't as certain. As I mentioned, my paternal side lives far away and didn't know how my parents treated me. I did try to speak up when I was 14, and my aunts, uncles, and grandpa reprimanded my parents. They pretended to apologize, but once we were home, I was punished and gaslit for lying. After that, I kept in regular contact with my paternal side but kept my parents' abuse a secret out of fear, which still affects me. Only my grandpa knew, but he was constantly threatened with being cut off from me if he did anything about it. My parents and I aren't from the same city. I live about an hour away from their small town, and they don't know my new address. This is intentional. My brother once attempted to break into my apartment to steal money, and my mother defended him, insisting that siblings are supposed to share their belongings. After that incident, I moved, and I have no intention of letting them know where I live. To clarify, my parents didn't buy my brother a car and a house before he started high school. He got a car for his 16th birthday and a house near his college when he started as a freshman. They didn't immediately spend the money from my fund but instead lied to me and held onto it until they decided to use it for him later. Now, before I get into the update, let me clear up a few things. The invitation explicitly stated that it was for my wedding. There were no excuses for not knowing. None of my maternal relatives attended the wedding. I realize I didn't make that clear in my original post. Some had legitimate reasons, while others simply made excuses but still sent gifts. I have no idea why my maternal relatives didn't bring up my wedding to my mom. I can't read their minds. My mother's so-called atonement consists of a text message apology. That's it. Now for the update. Things have been a bit chaotic this past week. I stepped away from Reddit for a few days to clear my mind and had a long conversation with Lucas about how to move forward. He has been my anchor through all of this, and I don't think I could love him more than I already do. My parents have always been a difficult subject, but Lucas gave me a much-needed reality check. We came to the conclusion that maintaining contact with them all this time and being unable to fully go no contact, NC, wasn't healthy for me. I finally realized that the real reason I never completely cut ties was because, deep down, I still craved their approval even now. I know it's pathetic, but being around my parents is like an addiction. They can be loving, funny, and warm until they're not. That small dose of affection makes you desperate for more, even at the cost of your own well-being. But I'm done. I promised myself that things will change. I've decided to start therapy and to go fully NC with everyone who turned this situation into an issue for good this time. After taking time to reflect, I messaged my father and told him that if he wanted to talk, we could meet in a neutral location the next day. He responded immediately and agreed. We met at a park, with my father's siblings, his sisters and brother there to keep things in check. My father looked distraught, as if he had been crying for a while. My mother looked the same, but I think her expression was more about anger and embarrassment. My brother, he just looked annoyed. I confronted them about how their favoritism toward my brother and their abusive behavior had deeply hurt me. I told them that after this conversation, I no longer wanted any contact with them. My mother kept trying to interrupt me, but my aunt, the one who made the Facebook post, shut her down every time. When I asked why they had treated me this way, they had no real answer. My father just kept crying and apologizing without providing any explanation, which frustrated my uncle. My mother, on the other hand, seemed like she was only just now considering the question for the first time, but in the end, she simply said she never liked me. Plain and simple. And my brother. He admitted he just enjoyed the attention and making me miserable for fun. I went on with my questions. When I asked why they never responded to my invite, they claimed to have never received one. I showed them the texts, but they denied receiving them. And well, it turns out that they hadn't, in fact, received my wedding invitation. When it arrived to their house, they weren't there. The only one in the house was my brother, who had come visiting for the weekend. He saw the invite and, as many of you guessed, ripped it up and trashed it. And then, when I texted my parents, he deleted the messages. Wasn't hard to do. According to him, they kept my chat archived and didn't get the notification. So, my parents never actually got a formal invitation. I was just distraught. I asked Mike why would he do that, and he just shrugged, and claimed that it wasn't as important as the stuff they had in program anyway. I had to stop Lucas from punching him in the face. Surprisingly, my parents were upset and started scolding my brother. He immediately threw a tantrum, complete with fake tears, and I have to admit I found it a little satisfying. But then my mom had the audacity to declare that everything was now resolved, that this was just a misunderstanding, and that it was time for me to clear their name. That was my breaking point. I cut her off and made it crystal clear that they were not forgiven. Just because Mike trashed the invitation didn't magically erase all the years of neglect. Besides, it had always been obvious that I was planning a wedding, and if they had cared at all, they would have asked about it. And you know what my mother said? She admitted that she had heard me talk about my wedding but assumed I was just being delusional and trying to get her attention by making up exaggerated scenarios. She genuinely believed Lucas didn't love me and would never actually marry me. When I tell you I was ready to punch her in the face, believe me, I was furious. Then, another truth came out: my brother never even had a football game that day. My parents took advantage of the fact that my husband, friends, and I don't know much about football, since we prefer soccer, and they used it as an excuse to dodge my wedding. They counted on me not questioning it, especially since Mike used to mock me whenever I showed interest in his games back in high school. At the time of my original post, I had no way of confirming or denying the game's existence. Mike's social media is private, and both Lucas and I are blocked, so I naively took my parents at their word. But the truth? They didn't go to any game. They went to Disneyland because Mike wanted to. They lied to me, using the football excuse to cover up yet another spoiled tantrum vacation for my brother. And apparently, this wasn't even the first time they had done this. By that point, I was completely drained, overwhelmed by the sheer amount of betrayal. Realizing how thoroughly I had been deceived made my blood boil, and I snapped. I stood up and told my father he was a pathetic, weak man who could never stand up for his own children unless my mother allowed it. Then I turned to my brother and told him he was nothing but a useless leech, a spoiled little parasite who would never accomplish anything in life because he had been coddled into absolute mediocrity. And to my mom, I told her that she was the worst narcissist, pathetic, little woman on the earth, that she didn't even deserve to be addressed and judged for her irrelevance. That not even God could help her out because she is just too rotten. Harsh, I know. My mother shot up from her seat to scream at me halfway through my rant to her, but I was just too mad. I shouted at her to shut the fuck up and sit down, and listen for once. She got so mad, it felt like steam was coming out of her ears. I don't remember much after that, just that I kept talking. And talking. It felt as if all my anger and hurt just flooded out. For a moment, I'm pretty sure the entire park went silent. I glared at my parents and Mike and told them I was cutting them out of my life completely. If they had any sense, they'd think twice before ever trying to contact me again. Then, without another word, I grabbed my purse and left with Lucas, Anna, and Francis, leaving my parents and brother to deal with my aunts and uncle's wrath. It wasn't until we were on the way home that the weight of everything I had just learned and said truly hit me. I ended up having a panic attack in the car. Lucas was driving, so Anna helped me through it until we pulled over into a parking lot so I could calm down. I honestly don't know what I would have done without their support. By the time we got home, I was emotionally drained. I collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep almost immediately. I really wanted to follow your advice and expose everything on Facebook, but because of my job and career, I couldn't afford to put myself out there like that. Sharing my story anonymously on Reddit was one thing, publicly blasting my family with my name and face attached was another. But I found an even better way to handle it. I compiled a folder full of my mother's insults, cruel messages, and nasty comments and sent it to the leader of her church. My mother had worked tirelessly to become part of that tight-knit community, but they are also incredibly judgmental, and once a scandal breaks out, there's no recovering from it. And sure enough, just as I expected, the fallout was brutal. The news spread like wildfire, not just through the church but across the entire small town. You can imagine what that means for my parents' reputation. Of course, my little act of revenge stirred up even more backlash. I started receiving messages from my maternal relatives, attacking me for upsetting my mother and berating me for what I had done. But at that point, I just didn't care anymore. I took your advice and cut them off completely. I sent one final message, telling them they were no longer part of my life and that they could talk all the trash they wanted. I wasn't going to waste another second on them. I also made it clear that they should consider themselves lucky I wasn't forwarding their nasty texts to their employers and spouses. Then, without hesitation, I blocked every single one of them, grandparents included, on every platform. I did find a lengthy message from my father. He apologized for not being strong enough to face my mother, agreed that what I said was true, and couldn't believe that he had lost so much of my life because of her. He told me he is going to divorce her no matter what my decision will be, because he is tired of being controlled. He would like a relationship with me to make up for all the years that passed. I did reply to him, to tell him that as of now I really don't want to see him or forgive him. He has replied that he'll try his best to win me back, and that he loves me. I replied back that, as of now, I find that hard to believe, and then blocked him too. Frankly, his slimy way of trying to have an out from this situation by throwing my mother under the bus is pathetic. At least, as she was hateful and owned up to it. He is only able to blame others for his choices. I don't want to surround myself with people like that. Just like the rest of my maternal relatives, my mother and brother are now completely blocked. Mike tried sending more messages to taunt and insult me, but I didn't bother engaging, I just blocked him. My mother, on the other hand, threw herself a pity party over being shunned by her community and her crumbling marriage. I had no sympathy. My final response to her was a simple, good riddance, before I blocked her too. On a brighter note, my grandpa has decided to stay with us for a while to support me. He's truly the best. He's even read some of your comments, though he'd never admit how much they flattered him. A few days have passed since everything went down, and for the first time in a long while, things have been peaceful. Lucas has been spoiling me non-stop, and I'll be starting therapy soon. I know this isn't the dramatic, revenge-fueled update some of you may have expected, but this is where things stand for now. If anything changes, I'll let you know. Thank you all for your kindness and support, it means the world to me. I think I'm going to log out for now. Take care. I've decided to start therapy. I confronted my parents and brother about their mistreatment, ultimately disowning them. I exposed my mother's cruel messages to the leader of her church, and now she and my father have been shunned by their community.